The Gospel reading is from the book of Matthew, chapter 18, verses 21 through 35. Then Peter came and said to Jesus, "Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "Not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. For this reason the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wishes to settle account with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him, and as he could not pay, his lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.' And out of pity for him, the lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves, who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him by the throat, he said, 'Pay what you owe.' Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you.' But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their lord all that had taken place. Then his lord summoned him and said to him, 'You wicked slave! I forgave you that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you?' And in anger his lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you, if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ.
I have an older cousin, and he's pretty funny. He thinks he's funny. At a family gathering recently, he roped me into a conversation, and he really had me going. I thought he was being serious and telling me some of his life wisdom that he has learned along the way. And in a completely deadpan face, he looked at me and he said, "Kristin, this is my approach to life. I get up each morning, I walk into the bathroom, I look into the mirror, and I say out loud, 'I cannot believe it. It's happened again. I got better looking.'" Yes, he really did have me going, but actually, he's not wrong. Wouldn't it be wonderful if each day you and I were able to get up, look in the mirror, put the previous day behind us, and begin a new day in a new way? And new is something that begins today in the church. I'm sure all of you know this, but today is the beginning of the church new year. Well, maybe not. Maybe that knowledge is only for nerdy pastor types like me, but actually it's quite fitting for today. Because today, for many of you, you are closing up your cabins or campsites to begin a new fall season. For others of you, you've been putting on backpacks and picking up your briefcases to begin a new school year. And for all of us gathered here today, in the midst of this pandemic, we are all desperately seeking and longing for something new. Something new. It is very fitting then that the beginning of this new church year begins with stories told by Jesus, Jesus' parables that we find today. And these parables lead his disciples into a new normal, an unexpected vision of the world. He reveals a vision in these parables of what living in Christian community looks like. And it looks very different from the world that we live in. We see this firsthand in our lesson today that was just read. Peter has a question for Jesus. Peter is Jesus' disciple who will flee Jesus' side on the night that he is arrested in the garden. And Peter will deny Jesus 3 times before Jesus is crucified on the cross. Therefore, it's really ironic that it is Peter in this story who asks Jesus how to forgive people, because it's Peter who will be desperately needing and seeking Jesus' forgiveness. And Jesus answers Peter's question. You must forgive people 77 times. And then he goes on to tell the story of a king who gives lavish forgiveness to one of his servants. Yet after this servant receives abundant mercy and grace from the king, this servant refuses to extend the same mercy and forgiveness to a fellow servant. Now, the focus of Sunday school lessons and Bible studies on this parable seem to focus on how many times we need to forgive someone. However, I don't think this is the real focus of Jesus' parable here. Jesus intentionally sets up an impossible task for Peter. You must forgive someone 77 times. Can't you just hear Peter thinking inside of his head, how am I supposed to forgive someone 77 times? I think Jesus gives this number to Peter so Peter will stop thinking about the number of times he must forgive someone and instead focus on God's endless supply of forgiveness that God has for us. It's God's forgiveness which frees us to extend forgiveness to others. I think this parable is really about the servant who, despite being told that his debts are forgiven, he really doesn't believe he's forgiven. Therefore, despite the lavish grace that has been extended to him, he cannot provide this same grace for a fellow servant. It's easier for him, or perhaps it feels really familiar to him, to hold on to the offense that someone has committed against him, rather than to let it go. The question today is not how many times should we forgive. The question is, do we really believe that God can do this for us? I have a friend who worked with a colleague for a number of years. At first, this colleague was charming and funny and kind. And the work relationship really clicked, and soon he was doing things socially outside of work with this colleague. It became a friendship, or so he thought. But slowly, over time, his colleague began picking away at him and his gifts and shaming his work. He began telling stories about my friend to other coworkers, and the coworkers believed it. It all became a huge toxic mess. A mess that prevented my friend from sleeping at night and dreading going into work each day. It came to the point where my friend knew that they had to quit their job for their own mental health. But to the surprise of my friend, his coworker suddenly quit. Now you would think this would have brought him great relief, but it didn't. Years later, my friend still says he will be driving down a freeway and wince as he recalls the pain and the hurt from this colleague. And my friend still lives in the shame of what he should have done or could have done differently to avoid his coworker's pain. And so my friend holds on to the anger and the rage and the hurt and the sorrow and cannot forgive his coworker. And what's worse yet, he cannot forgive himself for his naivety, his compliance in the relationship, and the trust he too easily gave to his coworker. I think this is why Jesus gives Peter this crazy number. Forgiveness is not a once and done thing. Forgiveness is a daily act of courage. Jesus is trying to get Peter to see that it's God who can work through human wrong. It's God who can enter into human wrong and bring about new life, even when we cannot. Joseph in the Old Testament was the young son, and his older brothers sold him into slavery. This heinous act resulted in Joseph experiencing fear and intimidation and false accusations and imprisonment. But it also led Joseph to a new life that would save Egypt and his people from starvation. Joseph encounters his brothers 4 times in this biblical story. And he had 4 opportunities to unleash his rage and his hurt. He could have even withheld food and supplies from his brothers. Only once does Joseph confront his brothers of their sin. And yet, he still extends forgiveness. He offers forgiveness because Joseph has seen and Joseph has experienced how God can work through human wrong and how God can enter into it and bring about new life. Joseph forgives. He lets go. And by doing so, he is committed to the belief that the past will not control his future. I work with kids a lot in church, school, and confirmation, and one thing I like to show them is this, is if you take a jar of marbles, what is the first thing that young children want to do? They all want to scoot up close to you, and they want to shove their hand into the marbles because they want the marbles, right? And they hold on. And then I'll say, you need to take your hand out of the jar, take your hand out of the jar. And they cannot get their hands out of the jar because they will not let go of the marbles. So what I have to gently tell them is, if you let go of the marbles, your hand can be free. This is what it's like to hold on to our anger and our bitterness and our rage and our sorrow when we refuse to forgive someone. Because Joseph forgives his brothers, does this mean that Joseph forgets what was done to him? Does this mean that Joseph becomes buddy-buddy with his brothers again? Absolutely not. Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, and Joseph is not naive. But Joseph has experienced God's unending mercy and forgiveness and work, and he will not imprison himself again by withholding forgiveness. He lets go of the marbles in the marble jar, and he's committed to a new day and a new life. Professor Christopher Davis says, what Joseph models for us is that when you have to deal with people who have wronged you, you have to make a deliberate decision to not rewind, to not replay, and to not repay. The end of the parable that Jesus tells today is really quite disturbing. In it, the king is so disgusted by the servant that would not provide forgiveness to his fellow servant that he throws the first servant into prison and is tortured until he can repay his debt. Now, before you judge the king too harshly or quickly, remember the parables that Jesus tells are all about things that we can see and things that we cannot see. The response from the king is a depiction of what you and I experience when we refuse to forgive. Our inability to forgive imprisons us, and we create our own personal hells. My friend continues to hold on to the wrong that was done to him by his coworker, and by doing so, he is imprisoned by his anger and his bitterness. And he too has created his own personal hell. And yet, I'm sure his coworker hasn't given him a second thought since he left. Jesus' vision for how we should live in community with one another looks so different than the world that we live in. Because Jesus' vision for the world is forgiveness. We live in a world that seeks retribution rather than reconciliation. We live in a world that seeks to blame people than be a part of solving the problem. We live in a world where justice looks like an eye for an eye. And we live in a world where people would rather participate in water cooler gossip rather than forging real friendships. These may certainly seem like easier ways to live, but these ways are based in fear. And ultimately, these choices only lead to our own imprisonment and our own torture. But Jesus offers an alternative vision for the world. Forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is not the easy way out. It's the really hard work to do, and it's really courageous. Forgiveness is not license for continued injustice. Forgiveness is letting go so that our past will not control our future. So what are you holding on to? Who are you blaming? Who do you want to hurt? What is preventing you from forgiving yourself? Whatever it is, I invite you into a new vision of living. A way in which even when, and especially when, our own efforts fall short, God's forgiveness is beyond imagining and leads us into new life. My cousin really did have me going for sure, but he wasn't wrong. Forgiveness is a courageous daily choice, a choice where we get up each day and we look in the mirror and see that we are God's beloved. And we see that God's forgiveness is beyond all imagining, and we can let go. And we can look in the mirror and not let our past determine our future. Thanks be to God. Amen.